They told me one day, ordered me to go down to the end of the field where there was a German casualty. And he had gas gangrene. And he was just put there to die, and you're to go there and sit with him while he dies. So I did.
I also remember how the combat affected people. He was cleaning his rifle and he shot himself in the knee. What it was really a self-inflicted wound to get out of the war.
No matter how you feel as an American, you're perceived by the way you look. Pearl Harbor, that changed everything. I could see the residents, the white residents, sitting out there staring daggers at us.
I've realized now that I'm here that really the years are getting shorter, and if I'm ever going to tell these stories, this is the time. Okay, it is recording. Would you please tell us your name?
Can you start anytime?
We're starting now.
Okay.
See, I even got my dog tags out for you.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Start talking anytime.
John, Akira Matsushima.
I am Bill Rice.
Jim, or James K. Sunshine.
Well, the name I'm known by here is Mary Van Nortwick.
Akira is my Japanese given name. That was on my birth certificate. John was a late addition. I remember when we moved to a new area, I was standing outside our house and the boy next door came out. He was an American of Chinese ancestry. And he asked my name, and I said, Akira Matsushima. And he said, no, your American name. Well, I didn't have an American name. That was not unusual for children of immigrants from Japan. So I was thinking, and I said, well, John.
I am speaking from the roof of the Advertiser Publishing Company building. We have witnessed this morning the distant view, the air bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
That night, December 7th, I remember my friend from across the street came to see me, and Mas Hamada, his name was, another Japanese American. And he said, are you going to school tomorrow? And I said, well, yeah, why not? And he said, well, maybe we'll get beaten up. I said, well, why? That Pearl Harbor had nothing to do with us. But he said, well, okay, let's go together. So we did. The atmosphere in the school was very different. As soon as we walked in, the white kids were huddled together, talking quietly. And when they saw us, they got quiet all of a sudden. And these had been our friends, up until then. And I thought, holy smoke, it changed overnight. We went to our homeroom class, and the teacher seemed to speak mainly to the white kids and didn't look at us Japanese American kids. Mr. Minch was his name. And I thought, gee, that's different. I remember earlier, I had to go to Japanese school, all of us did. But I remember, I wanted to watch the football practices at the American school after school was over. And I'd say to my mother, I don't want to go to Japanese school. I'm not Japanese anyway. I'm an American. And she'd say, go look in the mirror. So I'd go in the bathroom and look in the mirror, and there's an Asian face looking back at me. And I thought, well, I didn't need that as a reminder, but Pearl Harbor, certainly etch that in stone because to everybody else, my friends at school or the administration, we were Japanese. There's no doubt. You were the enemy. It's more difficult for some than others. I remember my wife, we'd go to a Japanese restaurant and she'd always eat with a fork, whereas I would use chopsticks. And that was so important to her. I'd say, well, why don't you use chopsticks? It's Oriental food. It tastes better, with chopsticks. But I think that just, that identity, I think, was just too sensitive for her. On December 7th, she would never leave the house. I'm still aware, certainly, of the 7th of December when I'm out, but probably much less so than my wife was. Still, I think it's a very pertinent date. That day when we were to be evacuated, we were told to go out, walk up the middle of the street. Both sides of the street were lined with soldiers, and they had rifles and fixed bayonets and helmets, and they were all lined up on both sides of the street. And we walked up to the Greyhound buses, I remember, that were parked. Most everybody were dressed as if they're going on a trip, kind of formally, in whatever good clothes they had. I suppose because they could take only what they could carry, so in their suitcases they had, I guess, their better clothes, and they were wearing their better clothes. So we got on the buses, and on each bus there was a soldier standing next to the bus driver watching us. We had to pull down all the shades. I don't know why, because, I was very familiar with Seattle and I knew what was out there, but I don't know if they wanted to keep us from looking out or keep the local population from looking in, I suppose. I don't know. I think the most frightening part was I'd look up in the grandstand and I'd see soldiers with machine guns. And I thought, gee, they're there for me. I'd better not run from here to across the grounds or something. I'd better walk, because otherwise they might think I'm trying to get away and they might shoot. And I thought, I wonder what it's like to be shot. But I thought in comic books and so on, soldiers were always fighting the enemy. But, here I was the enemy. And I thought, I just had a hard time getting a grasp of that. I thought, I'm an American. And yet here, I'm the enemy.
I served, I trained in the United States, and then I went abroad to the European Theater of Operations and finished the war in Europe. In the front line where the fighting is going on, there are field medics called company aid men. And their job is to try to stabilize wounded soldiers, then call for a litter. They pick up the wounded man and take him to a company aid station about 100 or 200 feet behind the fighting. There's a surgeon there. They further stabilize the patient, cut the bleeding, and so he's not going to die on the spot. Then the patient is carried back to a collecting station, which is another 100 yards back behind the fighting. The patient now is, he's tagged, and he's further wheeled back to a clearing station, which is maybe a good quarter of a mile behind the collecting stations. The clearing station puts patients in ambulances, and depending on the wound, they are either put in the ambulance and driven to an evacuation hospital much further back. If they are wounded in the abdomen or the chest or the big bone of the leg, they are sent over across the field to us. And that's all we did. And this was the salvation of many people, because 85% of them lived, which is the exact reverse of what happened in World War I with these wounds. So it was an accomplishment. We had a good time for 2 months in Bromyard. All of the GIs paired off with the land girls, and that they did what GIs do. This girl of mine, whose name was Joan, she was a very nice girl, so don't get the wrong idea. But we spent considerable time together, and eventually I said, I'd love to play tennis. And the court was overgrown. It hadn't been cut since the war began because there was no gas in the mower. And I said, I'll get some gas. So I went up to the motor pool and sweet talked him out of some gas. And we filled the mower, mowed the court. She got some flour from her kitchen in the tan house, and we lined the court, put up the net, which we found in the garden shed, and there were a few balls and a couple of rackets. And we played a set. And then at the end of the afternoon, we had tea beside the court with her aunt and Joan and me, and Joan and I. And that was that. Because the next morning, we said, get up, we're going. And so we did.
All day, Allied heavy bombers have been operating in support of the ground troops. They have encountered no fighter opposition. The action so far seems to have been almost too easy. But the reputation of the German armies is still considerable.
Eventually, the higher-ups decided that the invasion would go forward. Eisenhower decided, let's go, and we did. And so we steamed down the bay and around Land's End and up into the Channel. And there were the White Cliffs of Dover, just like Vera Lynn predicted. And on we went until we got to the beachhead, Utah and Omaha. And when I say we, there were ships coming from every port in England, joining this enormous force. And there were battleships and destroyers and light cruisers on the edges, and there must have been 500 ships, if you could look, within sight. It was incredible. He was a young kid, but he couldn't speak English and I couldn't speak German, except I knew Ja and Nein. So, and Schmerzen, help. Does it hurt? Schmerzen. And he would say, ja. And that was it. But I sat there all night while he moaned, and I gave him water, and that's all I could do for him. And at the end of the night, he died. So I got up and went back to surgery. I had no trouble coming back to America and getting transition. I just picked up at Oberlin right where I left off. We all did.
I ended up in the 100th Infantry Division, not the 106th Division, Infantry Division, which got the brunt at the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne, Belgium, where 2 of the 3 regiments were overrun by the German offense. What I really do remember was a day when our company got into very serious battle, and part of our company was sent over a ridge, and they got shot up very bad because the Germans came along with a half-track machine with a machine gun on top and just shooting arrow all over the place. And I lost a lot of good friends. That was the worst day of my life, or maybe the second worst day. But what I do remember is that they had us positioned so if the Germans attacked, we would be safe. Well, the fella in front of me, and that was probably maybe 40 yards, 30 yards in front of me, was killed. And I raised my head up, and I had a bullet go right through my helmet, in one side and out the other, through the helmet liner, which is underneath it, and I had a hood also on top of my head, and that even got a hole in it. So I really was, I don't know, quarter of an inch, half an inch away from having my head blown off. So that was my most scary part, When I think about it, it's scarier than I was then. The day that I got wounded, we were moving up again, up to the front, and some of the soldiers even rode on a tank to get up there a little closer. And we were told where to get in position. And the fella in front of me was hit by a mortar shell that killed him. And he had a girlfriend over there. So, and that was the day I was lucky. I got a shrapnel wound in my left leg, and it was serious enough so they shipped me back to Nancy, France, where the hospital was. And by the time I was well enough, the war in Europe had ended, and the war in the Far East was ended. So we were shipped off to wait our turn to come back to the States. Made some real good friends, and a couple of them visited me and my wife. So years later, which was great. I don't know, in a way the world has gotten better, but it's also gotten a lot worse. And you just roll with it,
I was born in Ukraine. I was born in a city called Ternopil. I have never seen Ukraine. I was 6 months old when my family decided, my parents decided that it was important for my mother and me to leave. My mother and I were put in a DP camp because, of course, we had no papers. And, I mean, this was the beginning of the large roundup of everyone, the millions of people who were like my mother and me, and like my father. My father had been arrested. He was in a concentration camp. At this point, it's 1945, it's just before my second birthday that the war ended. So that was when I started being in DP camps. I still have no memories of Landeck, even though I have pictures of it. I don't really start having memories of the DP camps until I'm about at least 3, between 3 and 4. So my mother and I were in Landeck, and the Red Cross finally managed to put my parents together. He, having survived the camps, had been making his way toward Innsbruck as they had agreed. So he was in Austria when the war ended. I remember walking to the gates and seeing the soldiers there and wondering why they were there. And I would look through the gates. Right outside the gates was the whole town of Ellwangen. And I remember standing at the gate and looking at all the people out there and the houses and wondering who they were and why I couldn't be there. Why were they there and why was I here? You're a child and you're suddenly in a new situation. You don't really understand what's going on. I mean, I certainly didn't. What I remember most is kind of a sense of puzzlement, trying to figure things out. That's the feeling, when I look at my memories, that's the feeling that comes to me most often, that I'm standing there trying to figure out who these people are. I wanted to find the school. I wanted to find the block that we actually lived in. And, I'd look at a staircase. I mean, they were all stone staircases like the one in the picture I showed you. And nothing looked familiar. And then again, I looked to my left, and there was the staircase. And I knew which one it was because when I was around 4, sounds like such a silly story, I wanted to understand, you have to understand there were a lot of people in the camps who were disabled in one way or another, mostly soldiers, men who had lost legs, who had lost arms, who were blind. And for some reason, I must have been about 4, I wanted to know how blind people walked up the stairs. So I closed my eyes and I started going up the stairs with my eyes closed to see if I could do it. And of course, after a few stairs, I hit my chin right here. I still have the scar. And of course, blood spurted everywhere and there was a big, hullabaloo. And so it's one of those things that's indelibly imprinted in your head. And I saw the stairs, and suddenly everything fell into place. I knew exactly where the hospital was. I knew if we turned the corner, I would see the staircase with the school. I knew. And it felt like home. The other important thing is that embroidered picture. If you look at it very closely, you'll see that the material is very, very rough. It's a sugar sack. They didn't have any fine linen in the DP camp. My mother made that in Ellwangen on that sugar sack. I remember her working on it. I remember asking her, she was sitting on her bed, and I asked her what she was doing. And she said, I'm making a prayer that somehow Mary will help us find a home. So after we got to Canada, obviously the frame is not from Ellwangen, wouldn't have been possible to carry it. But she had the frame made by a Ukrainian craftsman once we got to Canada. And that was another really important present. It has followed me everywhere since my mother gave it to me. And of course it hangs here. We have a lot of beautiful pictures, but that's the one I wake up to every morning and look at last when I go to bed at night. I can't imagine what kind of a debt to both my parents. you know, so many people perished, civilians. I hope in some way my life has been able to give back.